Welcome. I am James Edward Snap Jr. And tonight, we're going to take a look into James R. Edwards' pillar commentary on the Gospel according to Mark, investigating what he claimed about Mark 16, 9 through 20. Beginning on page 497, Brother James Edwards says it is virtually certain that 16, 9 through 20 is a later addition and not the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. He says the evidence for this judgment is complex. He then goes on to say, since none of the autographed copies or documents of the NT, that's the New Testament, survive, the Greek text of the New Testament is constructed from later copies of manuscripts dating from AD 135 at the earliest to around AD 120, 1200 at the latest. Now, in real life, copies after AD 1200 are used in reconstructing the text of the New Testament. For instance, the manuscript 205 is from the 1400s, I believe, and it is cited in the textual apparatus in the UBS and Nelson Island Greek New Testament. So that's inaccurate. Also, he says these copies, of which more than 5,000 exist, time out, that is also inaccurate. The number of copies of Mark is not 5,000. That's the total number of copies of any material from the New Testament. It's about 5,600. The copies of Mark are considerably smaller in number. More like 1,650 to 1,700. So that number of 5,000, has nothing to do with copies of Mark. That has to do with copies of any text from somewhere in the New Testament. And he says the two oldest and most important manuscripts of the Bible, Codex Vaticanus B and Codex Sinaiticus Aleph, omit 9 through 20. Now this is true, but it should be pointed out that in Codex B, 03, there is a blank space after Mark 16:8, and that blank space is just right to include verses 9 through 20. When the letters are slightly compressed, which scribes knew how to do. We see compression like that in Codex Sinaiticus in the opening page of Luke. So when he claims these two, you don't really see anywhere in his commentary a number about how many do include it. That number is above 1,650. He claims, as do several early translations or versions, including the Old Latin. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the only Old Latin evidence that he could possibly be referring to is the Old Latin manuscript Babiensis, which is okay. In that manuscript, Babiensis, there's a curious and somewhat iffy interpolation in Mark 16, 3 through 4. Between those two verses, there's extra material. So anytime we're bringing up the topic of the ending of Mark, and that manuscript comes up, we should also be bringing up that this manuscript has a resurrection of Jesus. It simply occurs between verse 3 and 4. So that is a tampered manuscript containing some non-original material. A scribe who is willing to insert original material would also be able to take away material. Babiensis is the most inaccurate copy of the Gospel of Mark in any language, as far as I know. The scribe of Codex Babiensis did not know his Greek Latin very well. He made all kinds of we would say, to put it candidly, dumb mistakes. But to keep going, when he says including the Old Latin, that's one Old Latin manuscript. That's not the Old Latin. There are numerous by numerous, I mean of all the old Latin manuscripts we have, the number that include Mark 16:20 is the majority. When we look into the Old Latin Capitula, the chapter summaries, we see Mark 16:20 included. So how he can say the Old Latin without qualification boggles the mind. Now, Codex Vercellensis is the only other Old Latin manuscript that I could imagine somebody thinking, well, this supports the ending at 68. But if you look into Old Latin Vercellensis, it's got missing pages toward the end. So you have to do a codicological analysis of that, and when you do a codicological analysis, you have no way of telling what the original pages contained if there were more pages in the original document. There could have been another folio, in which case a space-based consideration, or guess, doesn't really tell us a whole lot. So when he says the Old Latin, omit verses 9 to 20, in real life he's referring to just basically one manuscript. If you consider Vercellensis to be a coin that's set on its edge, and Balbiensis to be the only Old Latin manuscript of Mark that does not have verses 9 to 20, at least part of it, this is a very bad misrepresentation of the evidence. Then he refers to the Synodic Syriac manuscript, which is true, 100 Armenian manuscripts, and the 2 oldest Georgian manuscripts. That's also true. However, referring to the Armenian and the Georgian, you need to realize that Georgian was translated from Armenian. So it's like saying it's translated from the Armenian and an echo of the Armenian. We don't have 2 different voices here. We have the Armenian voice and then the echo of the Armenian voice in Georgian. Then Brother James Edwards says, neither Clement of Alexandria nor Origen shows any awareness of the existence of the longer ending. Now, where have I read that claim before? I've read it here in Bruce Metzger's textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. Now, many people, when they read Metzger, they think, oh, this sounds so objective and scholarly, but you're not getting the whole story. Bruce Metzger believed to his dying day in the Lucianic recension theory. They believed that the Byzantine text, the text that's in over 85% of manuscripts of the New Testament, he believed that that text was the result of a recension, a combination of the Alexandrian text and the Western text. So here we have James Edwards. I will quote this part exactly. Neither Clement of Alexandria nor Origen shows any awareness of the existence of the longer ending. That's James R. Edwards, page 497. Here is Bruce Manning Metzger, textual commentary, page 123. Clement of Alexandria and Origen show no knowledge of the existence of these verses. I'm reading a parrot. I'm reading Metzger redone. Then James R. Edwards says, Eusebius and Jerome attest that verses 9 to 20 were absent from the majority of Greek copies of Mark known to them. Let's turn to Metzger. Metzger. In the very next sentence, Eusebius and Jerome attest that the passage was absent from almost all Greek copies of Mark known to them. Parrot. I could say, and probably get away with it, plagiarist. He is using Metzger. Now, James R. Edwards does cite Metzger on page 498. But he's quoting Metzger without using quotation marks. So James R. Edwards, you need to do a better job with your avoidance of plagiarism, because it shows up very badly. Now, but his description of all four of these patristic writers is flawed. First, people reading his commentary, whether it's reading Metzger or Edwards, should realize Clement hardly ever quoted from Mark explicitly. In his composition, Who is the Rich Man Who Shall Be Saved?, he quotes from Mark 10 quite a bit. Other than that, he very rarely quotes from anywhere else in Mark. So we're looking at an author in Clement who does not quote from many other chapters of Mark, many oodles of 12-verse segments. I will include in my description down below a blog post that I made a while back showing how sporadic and rare Clement's use of Mark is. Also, when we refer to Origen, we're talking about an author who, again, does not use huge segments of Mark. So does his non-use of Mark 16-20 indicate anything about the contents of his copy of Mark? Not really. It's an argument from silence. What James R. Edwards fails to give his readers is a sense of what is to be expected from Clement or Origen. That's typical of those who simply read Metzger and find a different way to rephrase what he said. He says Eusebius and Jerome attest that verses 9-20 were absent from the majority of copies of Mark known to them. That's not quite what they do. If you were to read Eusebius' full contents in his letter to Marinus, you'll see that he said to Marinus, when Marinus said, basically, to sum up, Marinus said, how do I reconcile Matthew 28:2 with Mark 16:9? Eusebius told him, well, there are two ways this could be done. The first way is you can simply toss out verses 9-20, because on the grounds that what a person could say that it's not in all manuscripts, or it's only in some of the manuscripts, or it's not in the really good manuscripts, or it's in some but not in all. So Eusebius just throws this out there. That's not what he recommends. If you get Roger Pierce's book, Eusebius of Caesarea, Gospel Problems and Solutions, you'll see that Eusebius goes on to say you should simply read verse 9 with a comma or a pause after the words "and rising," and then there's no problem with harmonizing it with Matthew. So Eusebius in Ad Marinus tells Marinus simply read verse 9 with a pause. Now, of course, they don't have verse numbers back then, but that's the material that he's talking about. So that's what Eusebius does in his letter to Marinus. He says it could be said, but he doesn't say that's what I have found in my copies. He says it could be said. He frames this as something somebody could say. And but if you just look at it, you'll see what it goes on to say. Later on, Jerome, writing to a lady named Hedibia in about the year 417, recycles Eusebius' letter to Marinus. He takes some extracts from it and puts those in his letter to Hedibia to answer her question about the resurrection appearances. For his own part, Jerome, when he translated the Vulgate Gospels, he said, I used as the basis for this ancient Greek copies. Is Mark 16:20 in Jerome's Vulgate? Yes, it is. Now, Jerome was born in 340. And just making some deductions here, a person usually doesn't say something was ancient if it's younger than he is. So I would extrapolate that these manuscripts were older than Jerome was. So we're looking at manuscripts older than the year 340 as the basis, as the Greek basis for the Vulgate. Also, when Jerome is talking against the Pelagians, he mentions the Philologion, which is another topic. But he says, I found this after Mark 16:14. Again, he didn't have the same chapter and verse numbers we use, but that's the point where he's talking about. he says, I found after about 1614 this extra material, and I found it especially in Greek copies. So Jerome affirms its presence in Greek copies that he's seen. Now, let's keep going. The takeaway here is Jerome was simply repeating what Eusebius had written in Greek. Jerome was writing in Latin. As D.C. Parker says, Jerome is useless as evidence for the short reading, as he's simply recycling Eusebius' material. Then Edwards writes, an ingenious system of cross-referencing parallel passages in the Gospels that was devised by Ammonius in the 2nd century and adopted by Eusebius in the 4th century, hence the name Eusebian canons, does not include Mark 16 and 20. Wrong. As Dean Bergen showed in an appendix in 1871, if anybody would bother to read his book about the last 12 verses of Mark, it is free and available on the internet. That is a very common misunderstanding. Actually, what has probably happened is Evans is using an early edition of Metzger, in which Metzger said Ammonius, and then in a later edition corrected his mistake but did not acknowledge it. He simply changed the text without saying, oh, earlier I said Ammonius, I meant to say Eusebius. They're both wrong. Metzger simply messed up, and Edwards did not realize it. Ammonius cannot have been responsible for the Eusebian canons, and we don't really know what the Ammonius sections had. Ammonius, in real life, is a phantom witness, one of several phantom witnesses that I mentioned in my book, Authentic: The Case for Mark 16 and 20. Now, Evans goes on to say, although a majority of ancient witnesses, including Greek uncial and minuscule manuscripts, church fathers, and versions in other languages, do include verses 9 through 20, this does not compensate for the textual evidence against them. Again, why can't he be precise? Why does he just say some? A majority. We're not talking about a 51% versus 49% majority. We're talking about a over 99% versus 1% majority. Really, 1% is an exaggeration. Edwards goes on to say that regarding internal evidence, that the vocabulary is a reason to reject Mark 16 and 20. I will quote from page 498. In the longer ending, there are an additional 18 words that otherwise do not appear in Mark. Now, initially, this might seem like saying, oh, yes, well, different vocabulary, different author. But in real life, there are 8 other 12 segments of Mark that have more once-used words than Mark 16 through 20. And I've gone into detail about that on my blog. So is this really an objection when other 12-verse segments have more once-used words? Not really. Does Dr. Edwards want to draw those other passages in the question because of the vocabulary difference? So when you come to books like this, you only get part of the story. If you want to get the other part of the story, read my book. That's why I wrote it. The authentic, the case for Mark 16 and 20 is, in my opinion, the best case for this passage of Scripture. And will help you answer writers like this who are simply rephrasing, or somebody not rephrasing, borrowing, recycling, parroting what they read in Bruce Metzger's textual commentary. For instance, when Edwards writes in a footnote, the absence of the initial chi, and the absence of the presence of verbs, and the absence of euthus, Are these really objections? No. Bruce Terry online, if you go to Bruce Terry's website, Bruce Terry has already shown how silly and lightweight, how weightless this kind of objection is. These are objections that are made simply to make an objection, not made to get people to the facts. However, there are some positive things in Edwards' commentary. Page 499. He says, the earliest witnesses to the longer reading come from the Epistula Apostolorum, 9 through 10. Now, this composition was not known to Westcott Hort in 1881, but here Edwards affirms, as did Robert Stein, that it is a witness to the longer ending. Now, this comes from the year 145. That is far earlier than any manuscript witness against verses 9 through 20. Then he says, perhaps just martyr. I would affirm that. I would leave the perhaps behind. That's simply left over from Hort that was echoed into Metzger, and from Metzger into Edwards' commentary. Tatian Testosteron. Although Peter Head has questioned that Tatian using it, I have shown on my blog that his objection is unfounded. Tatian definitely used Mark 16:20 when he made the ditestosteron. That was about the year 170. And Irenaeus, in Book 3 of Against Heresies, around the year 180. But then Edwards says, this means the longer ending must be dated to the first decades of the 2nd century. That's not what it means. It means that these verses have attestation as old or earlier than almost any other part of the Gospel of Mark. Take that into consideration when you read your commentaries. James R. Edwards, I encourage you, do better. Thank you all for listening. Good night.